The gravel crunched under the tires, a final, defiant protest against the weight of the vehicle and the encroaching silence. Seth gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, the last vestiges of a long, monotonous journey falling away behind him like discarded skin. The road, barely more than a track, had narrowed to a single, rutted path, hemmed in by a relentless scrubland that clawed at the undercarriage. Ahead, through the persistent drizzle that blurred the windshield, the lighthouse emerged from the gray wash of the sky, a stark, solitary sentinel against the churning pewter of the sea. It was taller than he'd imagined, a weathered stone column that seemed to grow directly from the rugged cliff face. Rust streaked its white paint like weeping wounds, and some of the glass panes in the lantern room were missing, leaving dark, vacant eyes. A single, small cottage, built into the base, promised a semblance of shelter, but even from this distance, its slate roof sagged, and a window on the seaward side was boarded over, a crude patch on an old injury. This was it. His inheritance. His escape. Seth killed the engine. The sudden quiet was absolute, broken only by the distant, rhythmic sigh of the ocean and the mournful cry of gulls circling overhead. It was what he'd come for, this profound absence of sound, of people, of demands. He needed the quiet, craved it like a starving man craves sustenance. He stepped out, the damp air instantly clinging to his clothes, carrying the sharp, briny tang of salt and something else, a faint, earthy smell, like wet stone and forgotten things. The wind, a constant, unseen force, tugged at his jacket, whipping stray strands of hair across his forehead. He squinted, scanning the desolate landscape. To his left, the coastline stretched into a hazy distance, punctuated only by jagged rock formations and the occasional, stunted tree bent permanently landward. Farther inland, a skeletal structure, the old weather station, hunched against the skyline, its rusted anemometer frozen in a silent scream. No other human dwelling was visible. The isolation was profound, a physical presence. Retrieving a small, heavy iron key from his pocket, Seth approached the cottage door. The wood was warped and swollen, resisting his push. He leaned his shoulder into it, a groan of ancient timber echoing the effort, and then it gave way with a sudden, tearing sound, revealing a narrow, dust-choked hallway. He moved through the cottage first, his boots scuffing on the gritty floorboards. Each room was a testament to neglect, furniture draped in white sheets that looked more like shrouds, peeling wallpaper, and a pervasive, creeping dampness that seemed to seep from the very stone. He ran a hand over a dusty mantelpiece, the fine grit coating his fingers. There was no electricity, no running water. The lighthouse itself was accessed through a heavy, bolted door at the back of the cottage. He slid the bolts back, the metal shrieking in protest, and pushed the door open to reveal the winding iron staircase. The spiral ascent seemed to vanish into the gloom above, a dizzying vertical tunnel. As he climbed, the wind outside began to pick up, a low moan at first, then escalating into a sustained wail that vibrated through the stone walls. It sounded like something alive, something trapped and lamenting. He paused, halfway up, listening. The sound wasn't just the wind, there was a deeper, guttural hum beneath it, a low thrum that seemed to originate from the very core of the structure. He told himself it was just the old building settling, the forces of nature asserting themselves against its ancient bones. But a prickle of unease traced its way down his spine. He continued his ascent, his gaze fixed on the faint patch of light from the lantern room far above. The spiral seemed endless, the turns blurring into a monotonous repetition. He shook his head, pushing the thought away. It was just the isolation, playing tricks on a tired mind. He was alone here. He had to be. That was the whole point. Finally, he reached the lantern room. The glass panes, though some were broken, offered a panoramic view of the raging sea and the desolate coastline. The wind screamed through the gaps, carrying fine mist that coated his face. This was the heart of it all, the place that had guided ships, warned sailors, and now stood as a silent testament to what? He looked out at the vast, indifferent ocean, its waves crashing against the rocks far below, a ceaseless, hungry roar. He had sought solitude, but this felt different. Not just alone, but exposed. As if the very act of being here had drawn an invisible line, marking him as something to be watched. Seth killed the engine, the sudden silence deafening after hours of the car's drone. He pushed open the driver's side door, the metal groaning in protest, and stepped out onto the uneven ground. The air, crisp and tasting of salt and decay, bit at his skin. Above him, the lighthouse tower, a monstrous finger of stone and iron, clawed at the bruised sky. Its glass eye, long dark, seemed to watch him with a vacant, indifferent stare. He inhaled deeply, the smell of damp stone and forgotten things filling his lungs. This was it. His escape. His new beginning. The main door, a heavy slab of weathered oak, stood ajar, groaning faintly in the sea breeze. He pushed it inward, the sound like a tortured sigh, and stepped into the cavernous entrance hall. Dust motes danced in the anemic light filtering through grimy windows, illuminating a scene of profound neglect. The air inside was heavy, stale, carrying the faint, cloying scent of mildew and something else, something metallic, like old pennies, or dried blood. He tried to dismiss it as rust. Seth's jaw tightened. He wouldn't be deterred. He had faced worse ghosts than dust and decay. He moved through the ground floor, his boots scuffing on the grit-covered flagstones. The living quarters, once perhaps cozy, were now a tableau of abandonment, a skeletal armchair slumped in a corner, a table overturned, a scattering of brittle papers like fallen leaves. He found a small, cramped room off the main living area, clearly an office or a study. A heavy, wooden desk, scarred and ink-stained, dominated the space. Its drawers were stiff, resisting his efforts, until one finally gave way with a screech of tortured wood. Inside, beneath a layer of yellowed invoices and obsolete maritime charts, he found them, a stack of leather-bound journals, their covers cracked and peeling. The top one, its spine nearly disintegrated, bore a faded inscription, Keeper's Log, Emma Davies. Seth's fingers traced the embossed letters. This was a start. He pulled a chair closer, sweeping away a thick layer of dust with his sleeve, and opened the first journal. The handwriting was neat, precise, detailing routine observations of weather and sea conditions. October 12th, clear skies, moderate chop. Visibility excellent. Pages turned, a monotonous chronicle of the mundane. But then, a subtle shift. November 3rd, unusually strong currents tonight. Heard a peculiar hum from the deep, like a vast engine. A few entries later, November 10th, the hum persists. Seems to come from below the bedrock. An old mariner once spoke of something restless down there. He flipped further, the entries becoming more sparse, the handwriting less steady. The light seems to drain from the rooms. The hum is louder. And then, December 15th, they are gone. The crew of the Sea Serpent. No distress signal. No wreckage. Just gone. Like the Morning Star last month. The old wives' tales. They speak of a hunger. His breath hitched. Disappearances. A pattern. He could almost hear the wind outside, a mournful lament against the thick stone walls. He kept reading, the tension coiling in his gut. Not the wind. They speak my name. They speak of the others. They want. January 20th, I saw it. It calls to them. It calls to me. The weather station. It sees everything. The weather station. The name echoed in his mind. He looked up from the journal, his eyes scanning the small office. It was smaller than the others, made of a rougher, unpainted wood, and it lacked a handle, just a simple iron latch. His heart thumped a heavy rhythm against his ribs. He approached the door cautiously, his hand reaching for the cold metal latch. It clicked open with surprising ease. Beyond lay a narrow, claustrophobic passageway, leading to a small, circular room at the very base of the tower. This was the weather station. The room was dominated by an array of old instruments, a rusted barometer, a seized anemometer, a rain gauge filled with stagnant water. But it was the wall opposite the entrance that drew his eye. It was covered in meticulously drawn charts, not of weather patterns, but of the sea itself. Hand-drawn symbols, faint and faded, dotted the surface, marking locations, dates, and names, and everywhere, circles. Beneath them, scrawled in the same frantic hand as the later journal entries, were dates, and then, simply, gone. He traced a finger over one such circle, dated just weeks after the last entry in the journal. Emmet Davies, the keeper. He had meticulously charted not the weather, but the disappearances. And the last chart, pinned haphazardly to the wall, showed a single, large circle, encompassing the very coordinates of the lighthouse itself. No crosshatch. Just the empty circle. The previous keeper hadn't just observed the disappearances, he had tracked them, believed them to be connected, and in the end, perhaps, had become one of them. And the weather station, meant to predict the whims of the sky, had instead become a morbid ledger of the sea's insatiable appetite. He was not alone in this desolate place. He was merely the newest entry. The small door, tucked behind the stack of mildewed charts, seemed less a part of the lighthouse and more an afterthought, a patch on a wound. Seth reached for it, his fingers expecting a handle, a knob, anything to grip. There was nothing. Just the rough, unpainted wood, scarred with faint, concentric rings where something might have once been. He pushed. The door groaned, a low, drawn-out complaint, then swung inward with surprising ease, revealing a space darker and more confined than he'd imagined. A wave of cold, stagnant air, heavy with the scent of brine and decaying paper, washed over him. He stepped inside, flicking on his headlamp. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a cramped chamber barely larger than a closet. Along one wall, rusted metal instruments, a barometer, an anemometer, a hygrometer, clung precariously to flaking paint, their needles frozen in time. A narrow, grimy window, thick with salt crust, offered a distorted view of the churning gray sea. A small, rickety desk, piled with brittle, yellowed logbooks, dominated the opposite wall. This was the weather station. He picked up one of the logbooks. The pages crackled like dry leaves, threatening to disintegrate. The ink was faded, the handwriting tight and precise, documenting wind speeds, barometric pressure, and sea conditions over decades. He felt a faint, almost imperceptible tremor run through the floorboards beneath his feet. It wasn't the lighthouse shifting in the wind, this was different, a subtle vibration that seemed to originate from within the very stone. He paused, listening. He tried to rationalize it, old building, structural integrity, ocean currents. But the tremor felt intentional. That night, he found himself staring at a half-eaten meal on the kitchen table. He'd left his fork resting on the plate, tines down. Now, it lay across the rim, perfectly balanced, as if someone had placed it there with deliberate care. Had he moved it himself, unconsciously? He couldn't recall. His mind, usually so sharp, felt hazy around the edges, like a photograph losing its focus. The disembodied sounds grew bolder. A distinct thud from the floor above, followed by what sounded like a heavy sigh, emanated from the empty bedroom directly over his. He froze, spoon halfway to his mouth, listening intently. Nothing. Just the wind keening around the lantern room. But the sound had been too clear, too resonant to be merely the house settling. He remembered the journal, the accounts of the lighthouse keepers, the disappearances. He shook his head, pushing the thoughts away. Sleep deprivation, that's all it was. The isolation was getting to him. Sleep, however, offered no respite. The sensations were so real, so visceral, that they bled into his waking hours. One afternoon, while meticulously polishing the brass railing of the spiral staircase, he heard the distinct scrape of a chair moving across the stone floor in the main living area below. It was a sharp, grating sound, unmistakable. He stopped, his cloth still in his hand, and peered down into the cavernous space. The heavy, oak armchair, which he had left pushed firmly against the wall, now sat angled towards the center of the room, as if someone had just risen from it. His breath caught in his throat. This wasn't a trick of the light, or a creak of old wood. This was undeniable. His skepticism, once a sturdy shield, began to crack and splinter. He walked around the lighthouse, checking every window, every lock, every nook and cranny, searching for a rational explanation. A draft? An animal? A faulty latch? The lighthouse was sealed, silent, and empty, save for him. Yet the phenomena persisted, like a relentless tide eroding the shores of his sanity. He began to question his own perceptions, his own memory. Was he truly seeing these things, hearing these sounds, or was the relentless solitude, coupled with the grim history of the place, finally unraveling his mind? He'd stand in the middle of a room, listening, his head cocked, waiting for the next impossible sound, the next impossible movement. The lighthouse wasn't offering solitude, it was offering a stage for an unseen presence, and he was the unwilling, terrified audience. And the show was just beginning. The rough, unpainted wood of the small door offered no purchase. Seth's fingers traced the faint, concentric scars, feeling the grain, searching for a seam, a catch, anything that might betray its purpose. He pushed, gently at first, then with more force. The wood remained unyielding, solid as the ancient stone walls themselves. He stepped back, his gaze sweeping the wall, the mildewed charts, the stacks of forgotten logs. This wasn't a solid wall, it was a door. He ran his hand along the floorboards near the base, feeling for a hidden lever, a loose plank. Nothing. He returned to the door, pressing his palm flat against its surface, then sliding it slowly, methodically, across the wood. Near the bottom, where the door met the floor, his thumb brushed against a barely perceptible indentation, a tiny, half-moon crescent no larger than a fingernail. He pressed it. A soft click, barely audible above the distant groan of the sea, echoed in the confined space. The door didn't swing open, but rather shifted inward a fraction of an inch, then slid silently to the right, revealing a narrow, lightless passage. A gust of cold, stagnant air, smelling of damp earth and something metallic and faintly sweet, spilled into the lamproom. It was the smell of long-held secrets, of things left to decay in the dark. Seth retrieved his lantern, its beam cutting a wavering path into the blackness. The passage was cramped, barely wide enough for his shoulders, and the ceiling sloped low. He ducked, stepping onto a floor of rough-hewn stone, slick with condensation. The passage twisted, then opened into a larger, circular chamber. This was it. The old weather station, long forgotten. The lantern light illuminated a scene of disuse and decay. Rusted instruments clung to the damp stone walls, a barometer with a shattered glass face, its needle frozen at a catastrophic low, a mangled anemometer, its cups bent and broken, a rain gauge filled with calcified dust. A heavy wooden table stood in the center, its surface scarred and warped, littered with brittle, yellowed charts curled at the edges. He moved slowly, his boots crunching on grit and fallen plaster. This place felt like a tomb. No lock, no clasp. Just a snug-fitting lid. His fingers trembled slightly as he pried it open. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried, crumbling fabric, lay a collection of artifacts. A silver locket, tarnished almost black, its hinge stiff. A small, crude sketch of the lighthouse, its beam rendered as a jagged, frantic line. The top sheet was a hand-drawn family tree, rendered in faded ink. It was rudimentary, showing names and dates, some connected by lines, others ending abruptly with a stark X or a question mark. His own name, Seth, was there, scrolled clumsily at the bottom, connected by a long, unbroken line to a name near the top, Elias Thorne, lighthousekeeper, born in 1820, d. 1878. But it was the names branching off Elias's line that seized his attention. Many were marked with the X, their dates of death or disappearance unnervingly close to certain recurring periods. He traced his finger along a branch, finding his great-great-aunt, Eleanor Thorne, born in 1895, d. 1930, lost at sea. The lost at sea was scrawled in a different, more frantic hand. Beneath the family tree was a letter, penned on thin, almost transparent paper, the ink faded to sepia. The handwriting was spidery, uneven, as if written in haste or distress. October 17, 1930 * to any who might find this, or who might follow. My name is Eleanor Thorne. I am the daughter of the keeper, and my blood runs thick with the sea, and with this accursed place. They say it is the storm, the unforgiving waves, but I know the truth. It is the hunger. The lighthouse demands its due, a life for every generation, a thorn to feed its lonely vigil. My father, his father before him, my brother Thomas last year, all taken. Not by accident, but by design. It knows our names, our lineage. It has chosen me, as it chose them. I feel it drawing me, pulling me to the edge. The light, it promises solace, but it delivers only oblivion. Beware, kin. If you carry the Thorne name, if you find yourself drawn to this beacon, know that you are marked. The cycle repeats. Always. It feeds on our despair, on our hope for escape. Do not come back. Do not answer its call. They wait. They always wait. The letter slipped from Seth's numb fingers, fluttering to the table. A recurring tragedy, a generational curse tied to his very bloodline, to this lighthouse. He wasn't just an inheritor, he was a potential victim, an unwitting participant in a macabre ritual that had claimed his ancestors. He looked at the family tree again, his gaze lingering on the X's, the lost at sea notes, now imbued with a terrible new meaning. His own name, Seth, stood starkly on the page, a target. The letter, a brittle testament to generations of suffering, lay crumpled on the table. Seth stared at it, the words blurring, then sharpening into stark, terrible clarity, his bloodline, this lighthouse, a recurring tragedy. A cold tremor seized his frame, but beneath the fear, a hard knot of determination began to form. He needed to understand. The cryptic scrawl on the last page of the letter, a barely legible reference to the station logs, nagged at him. Seth snatched up the letter again, his fingers tracing the faint, faded ink. It was isolated, exposed to the relentless lash of the sea and wind, a place where records might be kept, forgotten. The walk was long, the path treacherous, carved through scrubby gorse and slippery shale. The wind, a constant, mournful wail, clawed at him, trying to turn his back. Rain, fine as mist, coated his eyelashes, blurring the stark horizon. The weather station emerged from the swirling gray, a squat, stone building with a rusted anemometer perched precariously on its roof, spinning a slow, protesting creak. It groaned, a sound like a dying animal, and swung inward to reveal a single, cramped room. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with old charts, faded instruments, and a haphazard collection of notebooks. His gaze fell upon a heavy, leather-bound ledger on a scarred wooden desk, its cover cracked and peeling. This had to be it. He pulled it open, pages rustling like dry leaves. The entries were sparse at first, records of wind speed and rainfall, then they became more personal, filled with increasingly frantic observations. The handwriting grew erratic, the ink smeared. He found dates, names, his family name, repeated over generations, always followed by an ominous blank space. Disappearances. Always disappearances. He focused on the page, his eyes scanning a particularly frantic entry, dated almost a century ago. It spoke of the hunger, of the lure of the deep, of the blood that calls it. As he read the last line, a phrase that seemed to be a desperate plea for deliverance, the page itself began to change. The ink of the writing rippled, swirling, as if alive. It was his name, Seth, drawn out, elongated, yet not quite his name. Then, a touch. He flinched, jerking his arm away, and the ledger clattered to the floor, pages splaying open. His eyes darted around the room, frantic, searching for the source. Nothing. Just the dusty shelves, the broken windows. But as his gaze swept past a small, grimy mirror hanging crookedly on the wall, he saw it. Not his own reflection, not entirely. It was his face, yes, but twisted, stretched, ancient, eyes burning with a desperate, ancient hunger he recognized as utterly alien. A silent scream was etched on its lips, a horrifying rictus of despair and craving. The eyes, fixed on his, held a terrible, possessive gleam, a recognition that pierced him to the core. It lasted only a fraction of a second, a fleeting, nightmarish image, then it was gone, replaced by his own terrified, pale face staring back. The air in the weather station remained heavy, pregnant with a malevolent presence that now felt undeniably personal. It knew him. It had seen him. And it wanted him. The realization struck Seth with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just an unwitting inheritor of a distant relative's property, he was the target. The generational curse wasn't just a story, it was a hungry entity, and it had found its next meal. He was trapped, not just in this desolate lighthouse, but within the grim, predatory gaze of something that had been waiting for him, specifically him, all along. The brittle letter lay twisted on the pine table, its words etched into Seth's mind like corrosive acid. His bloodline, this lighthouse, a recurring tragedy. He wouldn't be another name in the lighthouse's grim ledger. He wouldn't. He paced the circumference of the main living area, the rhythmic creak of the floorboards a counterpoint to the frantic drum of his thoughts. The entity, whatever it was, thrived on isolation, on despair. It had woven itself into the fabric of this place, seeped into the stone, the air, even his own mind. He needed to break free, to sever the connection. The first step was to reach out, to prove to himself that the outside world was still real, still accessible. A small, faded X marked a point several miles down the coast, inland a bit from the rugged shoreline. A weather station. He remembered seeing it on an old topographical map, a relic of a time when this stretch of coast was deemed more significant. It was the only place he knew of with a chance of communication, a landline, perhaps even a functional radio. The journey was a blur of determination and growing unease. A thick, gray mist had rolled in from the sea, swallowing the already muted light, turning the familiar landscape into a shifting, indistinct canvas. He felt eyes on him, not the watchful gaze of a predator, but something far more pervasive, a cold assessment that seeped into his bones. When he finally stumbled upon the weather station, it was less a building and more a derelict husk. A squat, concrete structure, its windows boarded up with splintered wood, its corrugated metal roof peeling back like a scab. A rusty satellite dish, askew and battered, pointed uselessly at the sky. He found a side door, partially ajar, groaning on a single hinge. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. A single, rickety wooden table stood in the center of the room, littered with ancient forms and a heavy, rotary telephone, its cord severed clean through. Disappointment gnawed at him, a bitter taste. He tried the light switch, flicking it uselessly. Nothing. Then he saw it. Tucked away in a corner, beneath a cobweb-draped tarp, was a large, imposing radio console. Old, certainly, but it looked robust, built for endurance. He approached it, a flicker of hope rekindling. The power cable was intact, leading to a corroded outlet. He plugged it in. A faint hum vibrated through the console. He pressed the power button. He fiddled with the knobs, tracing the worn labels for frequency and gain. Suddenly, a crackle. Then another, louder, like static electricity sparking in the air. The small, amber power light flickered on, weakly. Seth leaned closer, adjusting the tuning dial. A wave of static washed over him, then a faint, wavering voice. It was distorted, muffled, but undeniably human. "Hello?" Seth's voice was hoarse, thick with disuse and desperation. "Can anyone hear me? This is Seth, at the old weather station." The static intensified, then seemed to coalesce, shaping itself around the distant voice. He strained to hear, his ear pressed against the speaker. It wasn't a distress call, or a friendly greeting. It was reciting something, dot of the blood. The stone. The endless tide. Seth froze. The lineage unbound. His hand flew back from the dial as if scalded. The voice wasn't coming from the radio. The hum of the console intensified, growing into a low thrum that vibrated through his chest. The amber light pulsed, sickeningly, like a diseased heart. He scrambled back, tripping over a loose floorboard. The voice, now clearer, stronger, filled the small, claustrophobic room. It was not just speaking to him, it was speaking about him, the inheritor. Seth. The entity wasn't confined to the lighthouse. Its influence stretched. It had followed him here. It had anticipated him. This wasn't just a place of power, it was a radius of control. The weather station, his last desperate hope for contact, was just another extension of its domain. There was no escape. Not here. Not anywhere within its reach. The mist had thickened, swirling around him like grasping tendrils. He was alone, utterly and irrevocably alone, and the entity knew it. It had shown him, with terrifying clarity, that his will was its plaything, his hope its nourishment. The journey back was a descent into a deeper, more profound isolation, each step a further erosion of his resolve. The lighthouse, looming in the distance, was no longer a refuge, but a maw, waiting to swallow him whole. A cold dread, far deeper than any he had felt before, enveloped him. The entity wasn't confined to the lighthouse. Its influence stretched. It had followed him here. It had anticipated him. The weather station, his last desperate hope for contact, for sanity, was merely another stone in its sprawling net. The thought stole the air from his lungs, leaving him gasping in the biting wind that whipped around the exposed structure. He found himself rooted to the spot, his fingers numb against the cold, corroded metal of the weather station's observation deck. The anemometer above spun with a frantic, pointless energy, a skeletal bird caught in a perpetual storm. The glass in the small, grimy windows seemed to press inward, distorting the gray expanse of the sea, making it look like a hungry maw. Seth knew he should leave, should run back to the lighthouse, barricade himself in, but a morbid curiosity, a terrifying compulsion, held him fast. His gaze fell upon a stack of old logbooks piled haphazardly beneath a rusted shelf, half obscured by a tattered tarpaulin. They were bound in stiff, sea-stained leather, the pages brittle and yellowed. These weren't the standard meteorological records he'd skimmed before. These were different. He picked up the topmost one, its spine creaking in protest. The handwriting inside was tight, meticulous at first, then progressively looser, more desperate. It belonged to the last attendant, the solitary keeper of the station before its abandonment. The early entries spoke of routine, the monotony of isolated vigilance. Then, a shift. "My eyes are tired." Seth's own weariness resonated with the words. He flipped pages, the dry paper rasping like insect wings. The entries grew sporadic, filled with agitated scrawls and increasingly disjointed observations. It watches from the deep. Not just the lighthouse. It's always been here. Seth's breath hitched. This wasn't mere superstition. This was a man describing the very thing Seth himself was experiencing. He continued to read, each word a tendril of ice coiling around his own unraveling mind. The attendant had begun to experience visions, not of ghosts, but of feelings. A profound, crushing emptiness. Echoes of lives lived and lost, their joy stripped away, leaving only the residue of despair. The sorrow. The forgetting. He looked up, convinced he would see a spectral figure, but there was nothing. He returned to the journal, his hands trembling. The final entries were almost illegible, a frantic scrawl that barely held together. It is ancient. Older than the stone, older than the sea. It has no form, only hunger. And it is tied to the blood. To my blood. To their blood. It chose this place, this lineage, to anchor itself. A generational harvest. The words exploded in Seth's mind, not just as text, but as a direct, undeniable comprehension. It wasn't just a journal entry anymore, it was a download, a psychic intrusion. He felt the entity's presence coalesce around him, a formless, suffocating weight. It wasn't speaking, but showing him. The images flashed, generations of his ancestors, drawn to this bleak stretch of coast, to the lighthouse, to the lure of the sea, only to find themselves ensnared. Each one, a vessel of despair, a source of sustenance. The disappearances weren't random tragedies, they were the entity's feasts. It didn't just feed on despair, but consumed the very memory of joy, leaving behind an emptiness that echoed down the bloodline, making each successive generation more susceptible, more ripe for the picking. The lighthouse wasn't just his escape, it was his cage. His own troubled past, his quiet despair, the grief that had brought him here, all of it had been an open invitation, a siren song to the ancient, famished thing. It had drawn him in, anticipating his arrival, knowing his lineage, craving the specific vintage of sorrow that ran in his veins. He choked on a sob that never fully escaped his throat. The understanding shattered him. He wasn't fighting a ghost, or a monster with teeth and claws. He was fighting an elemental hunger, a primal force that had tethered itself to his very existence, to his family's blood, for centuries. The suffocation did not recede. It clung to Seth like a shroud woven from cold dread and ancient dust, thick and cloying. The entity's presence, formless yet utterly defined, pressed against the inside of his skull. It wasn't a voice he heard, but a cascade of images, sensations, and a terrible, undeniable understanding that bloomed in his mind, rooted in the raw data of the journal. The words he'd read, the glimpses of the past, now coalesced into a chilling blueprint. He staggered back from the desk, his hands clenching at nothing, his breath catching in ragged gasps. The air in the lighthouse tower, already heavy with salt and decay, now felt impossibly dense, charged with a malevolent static. His eyes darted around the cramped space, seeing the familiar objects, the chipped paint, the grimy window panes, the flickering lamp, as if for the first time, each detail sharp, accusatory. And, in a horrifying twist, it had shown him a way to sate it, a way to break its hold, to sever the generational tie that bound it to this desolate rock. A way out. It wasn't a banishment, not truly. It was a transfer. It wasn't content with just consuming, it needed a vessel, a conduit, a willing participant to perpetuate its cycle. The journal, he now understood, wasn't just a record of suffering, but a detailed instruction manual, disguised as a lament. The method was elaborate, twisted, and required a specific set of circumstances. Someone to take his place, to become the lighthouse's next keeper, its next offering. It wasn't about vengeance or justice, it was about survival, for the entity. He stumbled to the small, grimy window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. The vast, indifferent expanse of the ocean stretched out before him, gray and churning under a sky bruised with twilight. The successor. He had come here seeking solitude and escape from his own past, from the wreckage he'd left behind. He had dreamed of a fresh start, a quiet existence. Now, the price of that freedom, of breaking this ancient, suffocating chain, was to forge a new link, to condemn another. He saw it, in his mind's eye, a grotesque mirror image of his own arrival. And Seth would be the architect of that descent, the executioner. His breath hitched. This wasn't just morally ambiguous, it was an act of profound evil. His determination, which had been a steady flame through the fear, flickered, threatened by the sheer, unholy weight of this demand. It wasn't a threat, not exactly. It was an affirmation, a knowing pressure that seemed to say, yes. This is the only path. You understand now. Then, another image, clearer, sharper than the rest, flashed in his mind. A map, crudely drawn, yet instantly recognizable. It showed the coastline, the lighthouse, and a small, isolated structure further inland, nestled amongst the jagged rocks and sparse, wind-battered trees. The weather station. A place he'd seen on old charts, long abandoned, its equipment rusted and its windows boarded. The ritual required a component from there, something specific, tied to the collection of atmospheric data, to the subtle shifts in the air that mirrored the shifts in his soul. An old, arcane instrument, perhaps, or a logbook detailing precise atmospheric conditions on dates long past. It was a macabre scavenger hunt, leading him deeper into the desolate landscape, forcing him to confront not just the entity, but the physical remnants of its long reign. He swallowed hard, his throat dry and raw. The air tasted of salt and something metallic, like old blood. He could feel the fine hairs on his arms standing on end. The determination he thought he possessed was now a tight, aching knot of conflict. Could he do it? Could he sacrifice another, condemn an innocent to this fate, just to save himself? The alternative, he knew with a sickening certainty, was to become the entity's permanent host, to descend into an oblivion far worse than death, his consciousness subsumed, his body merely a puppet. He closed his eyes, pressing his palms against his temples. The images, the understanding, swirled behind his eyelids. The choice was stark, brutal, and demanded a level of monstrousness he wasn't sure he possessed. But the entity was a patient predator. A cold, unyielding resolve settled deep within Seth's bones, hardening him against the gnawing dread that had become his constant companion. The image of the crudely drawn map, burned into his mind's eye, left no room for doubt. The weather station. That was where it began, and where it would end. He gathered what meager supplies he thought might be useful, a heavy-duty flashlight, a tattered blanket, a flask of water, and a rusted pry bar he'd found in the lighthouse's forgotten cellar. Each item felt absurdly inadequate against the unseen horror he intended to confront, yet he clung to them as totems against the encroaching madness. The trek inland was a brutal test of endurance. The landscape, already unforgiving, seemed to actively resist his passage. Jagged, salt-scoured rocks clawed at his boots, and the wind, a mournful dirge, tore at his clothes, whipping strands of hair across his face. Sparse, gnarled trees, bent into permanent postures of supplication, offered no shelter from the relentless assault. The air grew colder with every step. A pervasive chill that seeped into his marrow, independent of the biting wind. It was smaller than he'd imagined, a single-story concrete structure, pockmarked and stained, its windows long since shattered, leaving vacant, gaping holes. Rust streaked down its corrugated metal roof, bleeding onto the grimy walls like weeping wounds. A single, skeletal antenna, twisted and broken, jutted impotently from the roof, pointing towards a sky that offered no answers. He approached the entrance, a heavy metal door hanging askew on a single, rusted hinge. The air tasted of damp earth and something else, something metallic and acrid, like old blood and ozone. He pushed the door inward, and it groaned a protest that echoed unnervingly in the sudden stillness. He flicked on his flashlight, its beam cutting a trembling swathe through the gloom, revealing a single, empty room, choked with dust and debris. A broken console, its dials frozen in time, sat against one wall, wires spilling from its guts like entrails. They weren't distinct words, but a swirling, formless murmur, a chorus of despair that clawed at the edges of his sanity. His own breath hitched, turning into ragged gasps. This was it. He forced himself to move, the pry bar held like a desperate weapon. He scanned the walls, the floor, searching for something. The map. It had to mean something more than just the location. He knelt, his heart hammering against his ribs, pushing back against the encroaching despair. It was a symbol, crudely carved, but unmistakable, a stylized representation of the lighthouse, and beneath it, a series of interlocking circles. It was the same symbol he'd seen etched into the old journals in the lighthouse, the one he'd dismissed as an archaic family crest. A new wave of visions crashed over him, sharper, more insistent. Not just faces. You are alone. You deserve this. The symbol wasn't just a crest, it was a conduit, a binding agent, a trap. And his ancestors, they hadn't just observed the entity, they had interacted with it. They had tried to contain it, to control it, perhaps even to use it. And in doing so, they had woven their bloodline into its very fabric. The weather station wasn't just a point of power, it was the nexus of the trap, and the symbol was the key. He, Seth, carried the dormant echo of that power, that connection, within him. The entity wasn't just feeding, it was trying to complete a cycle, to fully break free, and it needed his despair, his inherited vulnerability, to do it. No! Seth screamed, the sound raw and torn from his throat. He refused to be another link in the chain. He slammed the pry bar down onto the etched symbol on the floor, a desperate, futile act of defiance. The metal scraped against the concrete, a jarring sound that momentarily cut through the psychological assault. The entity recoiled, a shriek of pure, distilled agony tearing through the air, vibrating the very structure around him. Cracks spiderwebbed across the concrete walls, dust rained down from the ceiling. He clutched his head, fighting the onslaught, his vision blurring. He wouldn't give it what it wanted. He wouldn't break. He wouldn't despair. With a guttural cry, Seth forced himself to his feet, his eyes fixed on the crumbling symbol on the floor, the pry bar still clutched in his trembling hand. He had to sever the connection, not just for himself, but for every lost soul that had preceded him. The battle had truly begun. The metallic tang of the air still clung to Seth's tongue, a bitter aftertaste to the searing terror that had just ripped through him. He lay sprawled on the grimy floor of the weather station, his chest heaving, each breath a shallow, painful gasp. The wind, a relentless tormentor, shrieked outside the rattling panes, but the sound was a dull roar compared to the ringing silence in his ears. It was over, or was it? The question pulsed behind his eyes, a phantom weight on his chest. He pushed himself up, his limbs leaden, protesting. The weather station interior was a shambles, overturned equipment. Shattered glass, and a pervasive, acrid smell like ozone and burnt hair. Just the empty, echoing space, and the furious churn of the tempest outside. He stared at his hands, expecting to see them scorched, clawed, but they were pristine, trembling only from exhaustion. The journey back to the lighthouse was a blur of numb resolve. He walked as if through thick water, each step heavy, deliberate. The path, usually a familiar ribbon of stone and earth, felt alien, distorted, as if the very ground beneath his feet remembered the recent rupture. The lighthouse loomed ahead, a stark silhouette against the bruised twilight sky. It seemed different, older, more weathered, as if it too had aged years in the span of a single night. He hadn't noticed when it had ceased its rotation. Its silence was profound, not the absence of sound, but a heavy, deliberate stillness that suggested a deeper change. he pushed open the heavy iron door. It groaned, a mournful sound swallowed by the vast emptiness within. The air inside was still, stagnant, yet charged with a palpable tension. Seth stepped into the entrance hall, his gaze sweeping the familiar stone walls. No collapsed masonry, no shattered windows, no obvious signs of a struggle. Yet, everything felt. The very foundations seemed to hum with a low, resonant frequency that vibrated in his teeth. He climbed the winding stairs, each step a struggle against the crushing fatigue. The familiar creaks and groans of the structure were muted, replaced by an unsettling quiet. He reached the living quarters, the small, circular room that had once felt like a sanctuary. Now, it was just a space. A thin film of dust covered every surface, as if the very air had settled in exhaustion. Seth collapsed onto his cot, not bothering to remove his sodden clothes. He stared at the ceiling, the rough-hewn timbers blurring into an indistinguishable mass. Sleep was an impossible luxury. His body ached, a deep, raw ache in his bones, but it was the ache in his mind that truly gnawed at him. He had fought. He had pushed back. He had survived. But what had he won? The victory felt less like triumph and more like a profound, echoing loss. He felt changed, irrevocably so. His senses, sharpened to an unnatural degree during the confrontation, refused to dull. He could hear the faint drip of water somewhere in the depths of the lighthouse, the scuttling of some insect behind the wall, the distant, rhythmic churn of the sea. Nothing. He scanned the room, his eyes wide, searching for any disturbance, any telltale sign. But it was not nothing. The encounter had left a residue, a faint imprint on his very being. It wasn't just a lingering fear, it was a deeper, more insidious doubt. Had he truly expelled it, or had he merely absorbed a part of it? Was the malevolence truly gone, or had it simply found a new, more intimate dwelling? The sea stretched out, endless and indifferent. The lighthouse, a monument to solitude, stood resolute. But within its stone walls, and within Seth himself, a fragile, unsettling peace had settled. A peace born not of resolution, but of exhaustion, and the terrifying, dawning realization that the battle had not ended with a clear victor, but with an intertwining of fates. The wind, a relentless tormentor, shrieked outside, rattling the corrugated tin of the structure, a sound that seemed to vibrate directly through his bones. He tasted grit, a faint coppery warmth, and the stale, cold dampness that permeated everything in this godforsaken place. The light from the single, grimy window was a bruised purple-gray, announcing the approach of dawn, a dawn that felt less like a promise and more like a sentence. He didn't know how long he'd been down, only that the shivering had stopped, replaced by a deep, bone-weary ache. Slowly, agonizingly, he pushed himself onto his knees, then, bracing against a rusted filing cabinet, he finally stood. His legs trembled, threatening to buckle. The lighthouse stood sentinel, its beam sweeping the churning gray water, an indifferent eye watching. The world. Weeks bled into months. Seth had tried, at first, to leave. He'd packed a bag, walked to the small, rickety dock, and stared at the old fishing skiff, its engine coughing to life only on his third attempt. But as he'd pulled away from the island, the lighthouse's beam had seemed to intensify, to focus on him, a single, unwavering spear of light. A profound unease had settled in his gut, a sickening certainty that he was making a mistake, that he was forgetting something vital. He'd turned the skiff around, the engine sputtering in protest, and returned to the island. He hadn't tried to leave since. Life in the lighthouse settled into a peculiar rhythm. Seth meticulously maintained the lamp, polishing the huge Fresnel lens until it gleamed, its facets catching the sunlight like 1,000 frozen eyes. He oiled the gears, checked the fuel lines, and swept the winding stairs free of dust and fallen plaster. He repaired the storm-damaged window in the lantern room, sealing it against the relentless salt spray. These tasks, once chores, now felt like rituals, imbued with an unspoken significance. he no longer saw them as merely practical, they were necessary. His senses sharpened. He could hear the distant cry of a gull long before it appeared in the sky, could smell the shift in the wind hours before a storm broke. He learned the nuances of the lighthouse's groans and creaks, distinguishing between the settling of old stone and something else, something deeper, a low hum that resonated not just through the walls, but through his very bones. He spent hours in the lantern room, watching the sea, not for ships, but for something he couldn't name, a vague expectation that coiled in his gut. One blustery afternoon, as the waves crashed against the rocks below, sending plumes of spray high into the air, Seth stood by the railing of the lantern room, feeling the vibration of the rotating lens beneath his feet. A small fishing vessel, a different one from the supply boat that occasionally brought him provisions, appeared on the horizon. It was a single mast, weathered and old, heading towards the island. A tremor went through Seth, not of fear, but of anticipation. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to descend the winding stairs, to prepare the small, rickety dock. He watched the boat draw closer, its engine a faint thrumming carried on the wind. It was drawn here, just as he had been. They had simply changed. They had become part of the mechanism, the lure. He understood now. The horror hadn't ended in the weather station. It had simply found a new host, a new conduit. He felt the vast, ancient pulse of the lighthouse thrumming within him, a deep, resonant chord that echoed the beating of his own heart. He was no longer just Seth, the man seeking escape. He was the lighthouse, and the lighthouse was him. He was the enduring horror, the silent sentinel, waiting for the next ship to drift into its inevitable embrace. He was the keeper now, and the cycle, he knew, would continue. He had work to do.